At least she won't be a problem for long, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral. She thought I couldn't hear her. She was wrong. I stood beside Charles's casket with my hands folded neatly in front of me, staring at the polished oak that held the man I had loved for 47 years. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax. Soft piano music drifted through the room while guests moved quietly between rows of chairs, offering condolences and sharing memories. It should have been a day devoted to honoring my husband. Instead, it became the day I learned exactly how some members of my family saw me. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 71 years old, and 3 days before this funeral, I lost the only person who had stood beside me through every triumph and every hardship of my adult life. Charles wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend. The kind of man who remembered anniversaries without reminders and still reached for my hand whenever we crossed a parking lot. Losing him felt like losing half of my own heartbeat. Yet somehow, the grief wasn't the hardest part of that day. The hardest part was watching people assume my life was already over. As guests filed past the casket, I noticed something strange. Their expressions weren't only sympathetic. Many seemed concerned in a different way. They tilted their heads when speaking to me. Their voices softened unnaturally. A few even looked at me with the kind of pity reserved for someone facing financial ruin. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Grief has a way of making every glance feel heavier than it really is. Then an older cousin squeezed my hand and said, "Don't worry, Margaret. I'm sure you'll figure something out." Figure something out? I thanked her politely, but the comment stayed with me. Figure what out? A few minutes later, one of Charles's former golf buddies approached me. He patted my shoulder awkwardly and said, "You've always been strong. Downsizing isn't the end of the world." Downsizing. The word landed strangely in my ears. Before I could ask what he meant, he drifted away toward another group of guests. That's when I began paying closer attention. Small conversations stopped whenever I walked near them. People exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked almost relieved. Then I saw Vanessa. My daughter-in-law stood near the refreshment table in a sleek black dress, speaking quietly with two relatives from Jason's side of the family. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried once all morning. Instead, she seemed focused, calculating. Her eyes moved around the room as though she were already evaluating what belonged to whom. I turned away, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Grief affects everyone differently, I reminded myself. But then I heard her voice. At least she won't be a problem for long. The words floated across the room just clearly enough. One of the women beside her asked something I couldn't hear. Vanessa smiled faintly. Let's be realistic. Charles handled everything. Margaret won't be able to keep up that house on her own. The women nodded sympathetically. Sympathetically toward her, not me. I felt something cold settle inside my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. Suddenly, the strange comments made sense. Somehow, everyone had convinced themselves that my husband's death had left me helpless. Alone. Nearly broke. A burden waiting to happen. Across the room, my son Jason avoided my eyes. He spent most of the service standing beside Vanessa, quietly accepting condolences as if he were the person who had lost the most. I watched him shake hands, nod solemnly, and occasionally glance in my direction. But he never came over. Not once. Not even to ask if I was holding up all right. The service continued. Stories were shared. Hymns were sung. People spoke about Charles's kindness, his work ethic, and his generosity. I listened carefully, smiling when appropriate, thanking everyone who approached me. On the outside, I remained calm. Inside, I was beginning to understand something important. They weren't mourning Charles. Not entirely. Some of them were already calculating what came next. And every single one of them seemed to believe I had nothing left. I said nothing. I corrected no one. I let them believe whatever they wanted. Because the truth was simple. Charles and I had spent decades building something together. And not a single person in that chapel knew the full story. The funeral ended shortly after noon. Guests drifted toward the reception hall beside the chapel, carrying paper cups of coffee and balancing small plates of sandwiches they barely touched. I moved through the room slowly, thanking people for coming, accepting hugs, and listening to stories about Charles. Some memories made me smile. Others felt like tiny cuts. Every story reminded me that I would never hear his voice again. Yet even in that room filled with sympathy, something felt wrong. The atmosphere shifted whenever I approached certain groups. Conversations ended abruptly. Eyes darted away. More than once, I caught people studying me with expressions that belonged in a charity office rather than a funeral reception. One woman from our church pressed my hand and said, "If you ever need help getting settled somewhere smaller, please call me." I thanked her politely. 10 minutes later, another guest asked whether I had considered moving into a retirement community closer to town. By then, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone had created a story about my future, and it was spreading through the room faster than any rumor I had ever seen. I found a quiet chair near the back wall and watched. Vanessa moved confidently from table to table. She was not grieving. She was managing perceptions. Every conversation seemed carefully directed. Every smile looked rehearsed. At one point, I saw her speaking with Charles's cousin Harold. Harold glanced toward me, frowned sympathetically, and nodded several times. When Vanessa walked away, he approached me almost immediately. "Margaret," he said gently, "Charles would want you to be practical." Practical. There was that word again. "I appreciate your concern," I replied. "What exactly do you mean?" Harold looked uncomfortable. "Well, maintaining a large property alone can be expensive." I held his gaze. "Who told you I could not afford it?" His face changed instantly. Not guilt. Surprise. "I just assumed," he said. "Everyone seems to think." His voice trailed off. "Everyone seems to think." I smiled politely and changed the subject, but the damage had already been done. The narrative was everywhere. They all believed the same thing. Charles had died, and I was one step away from financial disaster. Across the room, Jason finally approached me. My son looked tired, though not from grief alone. There was tension in his face, as if he were carrying a burden he did not want to discuss. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he asked. It was the first time he had spoken to me all day. "I am surviving," I answered. "How are you?" He nodded without really listening. Then his eyes drifted toward the windows overlooking the parking lot. "Vanessa and I have been talking," he said carefully. "Maybe after everything settles down, we can discuss some options." I already knew what options meant. Selling the house, downsizing, relocating, becoming someone else's responsibility. What kind of options? I asked. Jason shifted his weight. "Just practical things. We can talk later." Then Vanessa appeared beside him like she had been waiting nearby. "Exactly," she said warmly. "There is no need to think about those details today." Her tone sounded kind. Her eyes did not. For a brief moment, neither of them realized I was looking directly at them. They exchanged a glance. A quick one, but it told me everything. This conversation had happened before. Many times. They had plans. Plans that apparently involved my future. Plans they had discussed without me. I watched them walk away together, leaving me alone beside the wall. Then I noticed something else. Near the doorway stood Richard Morgan, our family attorney. He had arrived quietly and remained unnoticed by most of the guests. Richard caught my eye and gave a small nod. It was not a greeting. It was a message that said he knew something important. And for the first time all day, I began to suspect that Charles had anticipated exactly what was happening. Richard did not approach me immediately. That alone told me the situation was more serious than I had realized. He had known Charles for nearly 30 years. He was not the type of man who relied on dramatic gestures or mysterious signals. If he wanted to speak with me privately, there was a reason. The reception continued around me. Guests laughed softly at old memories. Coffee cups emptied. Plates were cleared away. Gradually, people began leaving. I stood near the entrance thanking them for coming, watching the parking lot fill and empty beneath the gray afternoon sky. Several people repeated the same kinds of comments before they left. They wished me luck. They encouraged me to stay strong. They reminded me not to be stubborn about making changes. By the fifth or sixth conversation, I almost wanted to ask whether someone had distributed a script. Instead, I listened carefully. The more they talked, the clearer the picture became. They genuinely believed I would soon be forced to give up the life Charles and I had built together. They believed I would sell the house. They believed I would struggle financially. Some even seemed convinced that Jason would eventually need to support me. None of those assumptions came from nowhere. Someone had planted them. Late in the afternoon, the crowd finally began to thin. Vanessa remained surprisingly energetic despite the long day. She moved through the room collecting sympathy, accepting compliments about how well she had handled everything, and positioning herself at the center of nearly every conversation. At one point, I watched her discussing real estate with a distant relative. Real estate. at her father-in-law's funeral reception. The timing struck me as strange. Jason stood nearby, scrolling through his phone. He looked distracted, nervous, even. Every few minutes he glanced toward Vanessa, as though waiting for approval before speaking. It reminded me of something Charles had said 2 years earlier. We had been sitting on our back porch watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the hills. Jason and Vanessa had just left after dinner. Charles had stared out at the rain for a long moment before speaking. Jason used to make decisions, he had said quietly. Now he waits for permission. I remember laughing at the time and telling him he was exaggerating. Looking back, I was not so sure. Around 4 o'clock, Richard finally approached me. He carried a black leather portfolio under one arm. His expression was calm, but there was a seriousness behind his eyes that immediately caught my attention. "Margaret," he said softly, "when you have a moment, I would like to schedule some time with you tomorrow." I studied his face. "Is something wrong?" "No," he replied carefully. "Quite the opposite." That answer surprised me. Before I could ask another question, Vanessa appeared beside us. Her timing was almost perfect. "Richard," she said with a bright smile. "Thank you for coming." Richard nodded politely. Vanessa continued, "I assume we will all be meeting soon to discuss Charles's estate." The question sounded casual. It was not. I watched Richard closely. He did not answer immediately. "I have a meeting scheduled with Margaret tomorrow morning," he said. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly. "Of course. Well, I am sure Jason and I will be included once everything is organized." Richard simply nodded. Nothing more. Vanessa seemed dissatisfied with that response. For a brief second, something flashed across her face. Frustration, maybe even irritation. Then the smile returned. She excused herself and walked away. Richard waited until she was out of earshot. "Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, he said quietly. "Please come alone." Alone. The word lingered in my mind long after he left. By early evening, the reception hall was nearly empty. Staff members folded chairs and gathered decorations. Jason hugged me goodbye and promised to call the next day. Vanessa kissed my cheek and told me to get some rest. Their concern felt practiced, polished. As I drove home alone, the silence inside my car felt heavier than it ever had before. The passenger seat beside me remained empty. For nearly 5 decades, Charles had occupied that space. I reached a red light and glanced at the seat automatically, still expecting to see him there. The realization hit me all over again. He was gone. But as painful as that truth was, another realization was beginning to take shape. Charles had known something. Richard knew it too. And whatever it was, they had never intended for Jason or Vanessa to discover it this soon. I barely slept that night. The house felt unfamiliar without Charles in it. Every room carried reminders of him. His reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair in the living room. A half-finished crossword puzzle remained on the kitchen table exactly where he had left it. His navy jacket still hung near the back door. For 47 years, this house had never felt empty. Now every corner seemed filled with silence. Around 6 in the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching the sun rise over the backyard. The maple trees glowed gold in the early light. Charles had planted 2 of them when Jason was still in elementary school. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and found myself thinking about something Richard had said years earlier. During a dinner party, someone had complimented Charles on his success. Charles had smiled and pointed toward me. "People see the results," he said. "They rarely see the planning." At the time, everyone laughed. They assumed he was talking about business. Now I wondered if he had meant something more. By 9:30, I was driving toward Richard's office downtown. The building was an old brick structure that had housed law firms for decades. Charles and I had sat in those offices many times over the years, signing documents, reviewing investments, updating plans for the future. As I entered the lobby, the receptionist greeted me by name and offered me coffee. Richard was waiting when I arrived upstairs. He stood as I entered his office and shook my hand warmly. Unlike everyone else at the funeral, he did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with certainty. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I have had better weeks," I admitted. Richard nodded. "I imagine you have." He closed the office door and took a seat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he opened the black leather portfolio I had seen at the reception. Inside were several folders. Some looked familiar. Others did not. "Before we discuss anything else," he said carefully, "there is something Charles specifically wanted me to tell you." My heart tightened. Even after all these years, hearing my husband's name in the present tense still felt natural. Hearing it in the context of final instructions felt different. Permanent. Richard slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My name was written on the front in Charles's handwriting. I stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a short letter. The words were unmistakably his. He told me he loved me. He thanked me for every year we had shared together. Then the tone changed. If you are reading this, he wrote, certain people may already be showing you who they really are. Do not argue with them. Do not defend yourself. Let them talk. People reveal their character when they think there is nothing left to gain. I read that sentence twice. Then a third time. Richard remained silent while I finished the letter. When I finally looked up, he leaned forward slightly. Charles updated several documents during the last 3 years, he said. He was very thorough. I almost smiled. Thorough was an understatement. My husband planned vacations 6 months in advance and compared utility rates for fun. What exactly did he update? I asked. Richard folded his hands on the desk. For the first time since entering the office, I noticed a hint of satisfaction in his expression. Not excitement. Not amusement. Satisfaction. The kind that comes when a carefully built plan is about to work exactly as intended. Margaret, he said quietly, before we discuss the estate, there are a few assumptions your family appears to be making that are completely wrong. Then he opened the first folder, and everything I thought I knew about the coming weeks began to change. For several seconds, I simply stared at the documents spread across Richard's desk. There were account statements, property records, investment summaries, and legal filings bearing both my name and Charles's. Some I recognized. Others had never crossed my desk because Charles had preferred to handle certain administrative details himself. Richard opened the first folder and slid a page toward me. This is the current valuation of the primary investment portfolio, he said. I glanced down at the number and felt my breath catch. Not because I was unaware of our financial security. Charles and I had always lived comfortably. What surprised me was the scale. Over the years, successful investments, commercial properties, dividend holdings, and business partnerships had quietly grown far beyond what most people would imagine. Richard opened a second folder, then a third. Each document revealed another piece of a picture that had taken decades to build. Charles had not merely prepared for retirement. He had prepared for every possibility. Most people only saw the house, Richard said. They saw the cars, the vacations, and the lifestyle. They assumed that was the full story. I nodded slowly. And it was not. Not even close. He adjusted his glasses and pointed to a summary page near the top of the stack. Combined assets currently exceed $28 million. The room became very quiet. Outside the office window, traffic moved through downtown as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. Not because of the money itself. Money had never been the center of my marriage. Charles and I had spent years clipping coupons when we were young. We had repaired furniture instead of replacing it. We had saved long before we ever invested. The number on the page represented discipline, patience, and decades of shared effort. It represented a life built together. Richard continued, "There is something else you need to understand." He opened another folder containing estate documents. Almost every major asset passes directly to you. I looked up. Almost every asset. Yes. He folded his hands. Your family appears to believe there will be an immediate distribution. There will not. Suddenly, dozens of conversations from the funeral reception made sense. The sympathy, the assumptions, the whispered discussions about houses and downsizing. They had already begun dividing a future that did not belong to them. Richard seemed to read my thoughts. Charles anticipated that possibility. I thought about the letter. People reveal their character when they think there is nothing left to gain. The sentence echoed in my mind. Did he know something specific? I asked. Richard considered the question carefully. He noticed changes. That answer did not surprise me. Charles noticed everything. He remembered birthdays, tracked market trends, and could identify a loose cabinet hinge from another room. Of course he had noticed changes. The last 2 years concerned him, Richard continued. Particularly certain conversations involving Jason and Vanessa. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Hearing Vanessa's name did not surprise me. Hearing Jason's did. A mother never stops hoping. Richard reached into the folder and removed a handwritten note. Charles asked me not to interfere unless necessary. He wanted people to make their own choices. I accepted the paper and recognized my husband's handwriting immediately. The note contained only one sentence. If they respect you when they believe you have nothing, trust them. If they do not, believe what they show you. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and slipped it into my purse. When the meeting ended, Richard walked me to the elevator. Before the doors closed, he spoke one final sentence. Do not rush into any decisions, Margaret. Some people are about to become very impatient. As I drove home, I thought about everything I had learned. Yet what stayed with me was not the number. It was the realization that someone had already decided what should happen to my future. And judging by the messages waiting on my phone, they were preparing to discuss it much sooner than I expected. When I pulled into my driveway, I checked my phone for the first time since leaving Richard's office. There were 3 missed calls from Jason and 2 text messages from Vanessa. The messages were polite on the surface. Vanessa wanted to know how my meeting had gone. Jason asked whether I was home and whether we could talk later that evening. A week earlier, I would have viewed those messages as concern. Now I looked at them differently. Not because I had suddenly become suspicious of everything, but because I finally possessed information they did not. I walked into the house and set my purse on the kitchen counter. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the familiar room Charles and I had shared for decades. For a moment, I stood there quietly. The house no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, as though the years themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. I poured a glass of iced tea and sat at the table. Then I opened my phone and listened to Jason's voicemail. Hey, Mom. Just checking in. Vanessa and I were thinking maybe we could stop by tonight. There are some things we should probably discuss. Discuss. Another word that suddenly carried new meaning. Less than an hour later, they arrived. Vanessa carried a casserole dish. Jason carried a strained smile. They settled into the living room while I made coffee. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed harmless. They asked how I was feeling. They talked about the funeral. They mentioned how many people had attended. Then Vanessa gently steered the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. This house must feel awfully large now, she said. I took a sip of coffee. It feels like home. She smiled. Of course. I only mean that maintaining a property this size can become difficult. Jason nodded immediately. We have been thinking about that too. There it was. The conversation Richard had predicted. The impatience he had warned me about. I remained silent. Jason leaned forward. Mom, maybe it would help if we started looking at some options. Smaller places. Something easier to manage. Easier to manage. Practical. Options. Every phrase sounded familiar now. They had been rehearsing this discussion long before the funeral. Vanessa set down her coffee cup. And honestly, the housing market is very strong right now. I almost smiled at the timing. Charles had been gone only days, yet property values had somehow become an urgent topic. That is kind of you to think about, I said. But I am not making any decisions right now. The room grew noticeably quieter. Vanessa recovered first. Of course not. Nobody expects that. Yet disappointment flickered across her face before she could hide it. The conversation drifted elsewhere, but I noticed subtle changes. Every time the house came up, they paid attention. Every mention of finances seemed to sharpen their focus. Eventually, Jason stood and wandered toward the hallway. A few moments later, Vanessa followed him. They thought I could not hear them. The house was large, but not that large. Their voices drifted from the dining room. She is going to drag this out, Vanessa whispered. We need to know what is happening before the estate meeting. Jason sounded uncertain. Maybe Richard already told her everything. Then we need to find out what everything means. I sat perfectly still in the living room. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it confirmed everything. They were not worried about me. They were worried about information. A few minutes later, they returned wearing polite smiles. Nothing in their expressions suggested they knew I had overheard them. When they finally left, I locked the front door and stood in the entryway for a long time. Then I walked into Charles's study. The room remained exactly as he had left it. On the desk sat a framed photograph from our 40th wedding anniversary. Charles was smiling at the camera while I looked at him instead. I picked up the frame and remembered another thing he used to say. Never interrupt people when they are showing you who they are. I understood those words better now than I ever had before. Because for the first time, Jason and Vanessa were no longer hiding what they wanted. And they still had no idea how wrong their assumptions were. The following week moved slowly, but the pressure around me increased with each passing day. Jason called more often than usual. Vanessa sent thoughtful messages asking whether I needed groceries, help around the house, or assistance organizing paperwork. To anyone looking from the outside, they appeared caring and attentive. If I had not overheard their conversations, I might have believed every word. Instead, I noticed something else. Every act of kindness seemed connected to information. Every visit eventually drifted toward questions about meetings, documents, or future plans. 3 days after their visit, Jason invited me to dinner at their house. He insisted it would be good for all of us to spend time together. I accepted, not because I wanted answers anymore. I already had many of them. I accepted because I wanted to observe. Their neighborhood sat on the opposite side of town in a newly developed community filled with large homes and carefully maintained lawns. Charles and I had helped them with the down payment years earlier. At the time, they had thanked us repeatedly. Now I wondered whether they even remembered. Vanessa greeted me at the door with unusual enthusiasm. The dining table was beautifully arranged. Candles flickered softly. A roast sat in the center surrounded by vegetables and fresh bread. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Throughout dinner, the conversation remained pleasant. They asked about old family memories. They spoke warmly about Charles. They discussed vacations, neighbors, and work. Then, just as dessert arrived, Vanessa casually placed her fork down. "Have you thought any more about the house?" she asked. There it was again. Not grief. Not healing. The house. I took a small sip of coffee before answering. "No." Jason exchanged a quick glance with her. "You do not have to decide immediately," he said. "We just want you to think about what makes sense long term." I nodded. "That sounds reasonable." Vanessa smiled. "Exactly. We are only trying to help." For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "Out of curiosity, did Richard say when the estate review would happen?" The question arrived so smoothly that it almost sounded accidental. Almost. I set my cup down carefully. Not yet. It was the truth. Richard had not provided a date. Vanessa looked disappointed for only a fraction of a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Later that evening, while Jason stepped outside to answer a phone call, Vanessa and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. She loaded dishes into the dishwasher while maintaining her pleasant smile. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes change can be a blessing." I watched her place a plate onto the rack. "Sometimes, a fresh start can make life easier." "It can." She turned toward me. "Especially when people are living on fixed incomes." There it was. The assumption sitting beneath every conversation. She truly believed I was vulnerable. She truly believed I would soon need guidance, support, and perhaps permission. The realization no longer hurt. Instead, it clarified everything. When I returned home that night, I found an envelope waiting in my mailbox. The return address belonged to Richard's office. Inside was a short note requesting my presence at a formal family meeting the following Friday afternoon. No details, no explanations, just a time and location. I read the note twice before setting it on the kitchen table. Then I noticed something written in Richard's familiar handwriting at the bottom of the page. "Please bring no documents. Simply come prepared to listen." I smiled for the first time in days. Because something told me Richard had finally decided the waiting was over. And if I was right, several people were about to hear a version of the future they never expected. The following Monday, I arrived at the attorney's office 10 minutes early. The summer sun reflected off the glass buildings downtown, but inside, the conference room felt cool and still. I sat quietly at the long oak table, folding my hands in my lap while I waited. Through the window, I could see people hurrying along the sidewalk below, each carrying their own worries, their own secrets. Mine no longer felt like a burden. It felt like clarity. A few minutes later, my son and daughter-in-law walked in together. The confidence they had carried for months was still visible in the way they moved. They greeted the attorney with polite smiles. They barely looked at me. That hurt more than I wanted to admit, but it no longer controlled me. There had been a time when I would have spent hours wondering what I had done wrong. Now I understood that some people do not drift away because of your failures. They drift away because your kindness has become convenient. The attorney placed several folders on the table and began reviewing documents. My daughter-in-law leaned back comfortably in her chair. My son nodded along as if everything had already been decided. I listened without interruption. Every page that turned seemed to reveal another assumption they had made about my future. They assumed I would remain silent. They assumed grief had weakened me. They assumed I would accept whatever place they assigned me. What they never considered was that years of sacrifice teach a person patience. And patience, when combined with truth, can be far more powerful than anger. Eventually, the attorney opened the final folder. The room grew noticeably quieter. My daughter-in-law straightened in her seat. My son glanced toward her before looking back at the paperwork. The attorney cleared his throat and carefully explained several details that had been overlooked. Certain assets were not owned the way they believed. Certain decisions required approvals they did not possess. Most importantly, several legal protections had been established years earlier. Long before any of this began, long before my husband passed away, I watched their expressions change one small piece at a time. Confidence became confusion. Confusion became concern. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence felt heavy but deserved. Not because I wanted revenge, because for the first time, they were facing reality instead of assumptions. My son finally turned toward me. His voice was softer than it had been in months. He asked why I had never mentioned any of it. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because nobody asked. The words were simple, but they carried years of disappointment. I had spent so much of my life explaining myself, defending myself, proving my worth. Somewhere along the way, I realized that people who truly care will ask. People who only care about what they can gain usually do not. My daughter-in-law lowered her eyes to the table. The room felt different now. Not victorious. Not dramatic. Just honest. And honesty has a way of changing everything. When the meeting ended, I gathered my purse and stood. Nobody stopped me. Nobody argued. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt something unexpected settle inside my chest. Peace. Not because every problem had been solved. Not because every wound had healed. But because the truth no longer belonged only to me. The truth was finally sitting in the open where everyone could see it. And for the first time since losing my husband, I stepped forward not as a woman being pushed aside, but as a woman reclaiming her place in her own story. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not because the tension had disappeared, but because something fundamental had changed. For months, perhaps even years, I had been carrying the weight of uncertainty. I had questioned my memories, my instincts, and sometimes even my own worth. Now that burden was gone. The truth had settled into place, and no amount of denial could move it. 3 days after the meeting, my son called. His name appeared on my phone just as I was watering the flower beds behind the house. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. His voice sounded tired. Older somehow. We spoke politely at first. The weather. The garden. Small things that people discuss when they are standing on opposite sides of a broken bridge and neither knows how to cross it. Finally, he grew quiet. Then he asked a question I had waited a long time to hear. He asked if I had known all along. I looked across the backyard at the roses my husband had planted years ago. Their blooms swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Yes, I said. Not everything, but enough. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. He apologized. Not dramatically. Not perfectly, just quietly, the way people do when they are finally forced to face themselves. I listened without interrupting. There was a time when I would have rushed to make him feel better, a time when I would have minimized my own pain to protect his comfort. But some lessons arrive late in life. One of mine was learning that forgiveness and accountability are not the same thing. When he finished speaking, I thanked him for the apology. Then I told him something he needed to hear. Trust is not rebuilt with words. It is rebuilt with time. After we ended the call, I sat alone on the back porch. The house felt different now. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. For the first time since my husband's passing, I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. The following weekend, several neighbors stopped by with homemade desserts and fresh vegetables from their gardens. Small gestures, simple kindnesses. Yet they reminded me of something important. Family is not always limited to the people who share your last name. Sometimes it includes the people who show up when they have no obligation to do so. As evening approached, I found myself standing in the living room looking at an old photograph. My husband was smiling beside me, one arm around my shoulders. Our son stood in front of us, barely 10 years old, grinning with missing front teeth. I remembered that little boy, the one who used to run through the sprinkler on hot summer afternoons, the one who brought me wildflowers from empty fields and insisted they were treasures. Somewhere along the way, life had complicated everything. But looking at that picture, I realized something. The story was not over. Pain had changed us. Mistakes had changed us. But endings are rarely as final as they first appear. Later that night, I received a short message from my son. There was no excuse, no explanation, just a simple sentence. I hope someday I can earn back your trust. I read the message twice before setting down the phone. Then I turned off the lamp and sat quietly in the darkness. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. Inside, for the first time in a very long while, I felt no need to fight, no need to prove anything, and no need to chase people who had chosen distance. The truth had already done the work for me. Now all that remained was deciding what kind of future I wanted to build from the pieces that were left.